Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Trevor Bird. Trevor is a personal and professional development coach, certified in the internal family systems modality of therapy with a deep dedication to helping men heal and grow. Trevor's mission is rooted in a profound personal experience of reconnecting with his father's memory after learning of his passing. Through the process of healing by foregoing and addressing familial shame, his father's spirit now works through him, guiding his efforts to help other men overcome and understand their own shame. Trevor hopes that by sharing his story, he can inspire fathers, mothers, and siblings to reconnect, breaking free from the isolation that shame can create. So, Trevor, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you for having me, man. Honored to be here with you.
I appreciate that. Also, I gave a bit of an introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today?
Yeah. And I tell myself I'm like zooming way out, and then we'll kind of get into the core message of how you introduced me.
Sure.
Um, so I have been a chef for 25 years, and I opened restaurants and had all the success on paper, working obscene amounts of hours, really, workaholism. And through that journey of wondering why I was doing what I was doing, I started very young. I started cooking it when I was 14 years old. Um, the kitchens were a perfect place to avoid all of my pain
Mm.
because it was a culture, it was a community. You go in there, you work really hard, people say good job, great stuff, and you're like, oh great, this is awesome. And I don't know if you know much about hospitality industry, but it can be pretty rough, pretty aggressive. And I continue on that journey. I was on a reality TV show called Top Chef, and I did really well on that. And I was like, oh well, my life is all coming together, it's going swimmingly well. And I open the restaurants, I meet the girl, and then about 2 years into that relationship, she's pregnant, and then she starts to come in with like, this isn't the life that I want. Like, you are never home. It's great when we're single and we don't have too much responsibilities, but she's like, you're never home, you work all the time, you're pretty emotionally volatile, which I was. I'd have monthly kind of emotional breakdowns of like, if you work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, and have very little time to yourself, that's usually what tends to happen.
Sure.
And she kind of said, she gave me an ultimatum. She's like, yeah, you should go get some help or I'm going to leave, because this is not how I see myself living in the next decade. And so I reached out to a men's group, Connor Beaton and Man Talks, in 2015. And he invited me to a small group setting. It's a yearly commitment. And the first weekend I got there was my first step into vulnerability, was my first step into like looking at like what was actually going on for me. And I'll never forget, because I'm still friends with these guys today. They're still very close to me. And they remind me all the time. It's like, man, you've come so far. When you first walked into that room, I had like fire in my eyes. I was just like this is how I looked all the time.
Mm.
Just furrowed brow, looking angry, mad, like intense. Like I still do have intensity, but I was very intense at that time in my life. And the questions, the reflections that I got from those men talking about a supportive community or supportive group, it was the first time that I actually surrounded myself with men that gave it, and they just met me.
Mm.
Men that really cared, that just met me, and they said, hey, like, you look miserable, man, are you okay?
Wow.
And that was kind of like, that reflection was just completely opened me up, because I was like, you know what, I'm not okay. I don't like my life. I don't like what I'm doing. I don't like what I stand for. I don't even like myself. And having other men to compassionately say, "Hey, we see that in you." I even feel emotional like talking about this. Is like, we see you and we want to see you succeed. What needs to happen? And that was the kind of the beginning journey of looking at my own shame, looking at why I was doing what I was doing, and making sense of my own inner conflicts to bring my whole self online. So I think I'll start like that's the beginning of my journey there. Um, and I remember an exercise that we did in one of those weekends was uh, talk about your family of origin. And my God,
Mm.
I could always talk about it from like a jokingly kind of like, oh, this happened and this happened. And like my mom was an addict and my dad was, mentally, had his mental health challenges and bipolar. And there's like all this like funny things that happen. And when I actually dropped into beyond like making light of it or making fun of it, I came undone, man. Like that was like really acknowledging the pain, the intensity in the environment that I grew up in, really began to set me on a path of how do I create the life that I want to have, that I want to, the relationships that I want to be in. Because, when I grew up very poor, single mom. My dad left when I was 6. Uh, my mom was an addict. My dad was an addict. My dad left and came back, and I've heard stories recently of like my mom she was a flight attendant, so she would leave for several days at a time with my dad, and then she would come home and there'd be a babysitter there, and she'd be like, "Where's my husband?" And he'd be like, "Oh, like he hasn't been here for 3 days. He just like hired me, and I'm just taking care of the kids."
Wow.
And so I'm left in the home with these people that I don't know, and there's so much other stuff that comes along with that. Um, but just for I just really acknowledging how hard that was as a kid, inner child work, going back to that little boy and being like, "Yo, are you okay?
Mm.
Like, what's happening for you?" And through really making connections with my parts in that way, um, created a lot of transformation in my life and started to reintegrate a very fragmented system. I believe that when somebody goes through a lot of trauma or is exposed to a lot of adverse experiences growing up, it's very easy for our system to fragment. And I'm going to use a lot of IFS language. And hopefully, if it's not clear, please just ask any questions. But the belief is that we're all multiple parts. We all have multiple personalities inside of us, and when we go through a lot of traumas, we are parts get stuck in certain places. And so I had really young wounded parts that were abused, parts that were not good enough, a lot of exiles in the basement, and a lot of big protectors, a lot of reactive protectors. So growing up in a household with lots of physical, emotional, sexual abuse, all these like things that are like, if you've ever heard of the adverse childhood experiences survey,
Mhm.
yeah, like I'm a 10 out of 10 on that list.
Okay.
Check every box. And when you actually look at the fragmentation that happens within each one of those adverse experiences, there's a lot of constellations. There's a lot of parts of you that have inner conflict that are like fighting against each other, saying, "You're not good enough, go away." A lot of inner critics, lots of negative self talk, lots of like not very, not a lot of self belief in what I could do or accomplish. And so through this men's group work and kind of looking at all of this, the healing journey started. There was no framework yet of IFS or nothing there, but I was like remaking friends with these parts of myself that I hated and didn't like and didn't know how to be in a relationship and like cheated on girls and did all these things that wouldn't be socially acceptable or like you don't really like. And then I was introduced to IFS, and it just made all the puzzle pieces click.
Mm.
Like everything came together. That was in 2018, I believe. I took a training through IFSCA, and I just because I was really into like figuring myself out, what drove me, what made me tick, and yeah, that just like that was like this is how it all fits. This is how all of my parts are getting along, and that sent me on the journey of this is what I'm going to be dedicated to, very passionate about. And from 2018 to 2021, I made the very difficult decision to let go of my career and step into coaching, helping men, and I do see women as well. But it's kind of just like created this own little natural environment of word of mouth and people coming in just being like, hey, this is what I'm struggling with. And I see a whole bunch of people, and I primarily work with men just because that's what reaches out to me and that's what I speak through. So I'll get more into the story and my father as we go through this, but that's kind of the basis of how I came into this and how I started.
Appreciate you sharing that. I dropped a pin when you were speaking because I wanted to go back to something when you were at the retreat and you were talking about your family of origin, and you said that you had always done it in a way, I guess, that was joking or what have you. You made light of it. Do you think that in that moment, that was the first time you actually allowed yourself to have the awareness of how difficult it was and you felt the pain of it?
Absolutely, man.
Mm.
You know, those minimizing parts, the parts that make light of, the parts that laugh, God bless them. You know, they're amazing protectors, right?
Hmm.
But they keep the pain at bay.
Right,
And the community that I was surrounded with could not receive the pain at the time. So, but they could receive a joke.
right, right.
They could receive the lightness of it. But, you know, having that group of men that could receive the pain of it, that could hold space for it, that would be like, you know, why are you laughing about that? That doesn't sound funny.
Mm.
Like that's like, what do you mean?
Right,
Like it's
right.
actually not funny. Like it's actually extremely painful.
Wow. Um, I've heard that trauma survivors are some of the funniest people on the planet because they have to joke about it. Otherwise, they have to acknowledge what happened. And there may not always be room or space to do that, especially if you are uncomfortable feeling your feelings. So, to avoid feeling your feelings, you make jokes and you become funny, and you're the life of the party, and everybody knows you as that funny person, and you almost that becomes your identity. And that in and of itself is a part that is protecting you from feeling those feelings and the reality of your situation.
I definitely agree with that, and you say that, and that sounds very true, for
Indeed.
sure.
um Thank you so much for sharing that, and giving us a window into who you are and how you got started and your healing journey and how you began coaching and helping other people. um when we first connected and you reached out to me, you shared where and how the origin of your mission began, and my heart opened completely because it was such a big story and um, difficult and transformative all in one. And I felt such a deep gratitude for how you're using your personal experience to help others.
Mm.
So I wanted to honor your story and allow you to share the reason behind your work, if you'd be willing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, going down this journey, I start to get curious about my father because I haven't seen him in 25 years, and starting to understand that, whew, yeah, like if I get emotional, you know, it's so alive in me just because it's sacred work. But when we start to do our own healing journey, we start to see how everybody on this planet is doing the best they can with the tools they have.
Right.
Um, my dad, who I have not who was an addict, who had his own struggles. I heard stories about him. The his Our community painted him as some villain, right? Like, don't get my brother, don't get involved with dad. He's crazy. My mom, he's a narcissistic, blah blah blah, all this stuff. He's just going to bring pain to your life. And so, I'm like, whoa, like this guy sounds like he's dangerous. Like I should probably not reach out to him. But as I start healing my own kind of shame and my own things that I don't like about myself, I'm like, man, my dad was probably a pretty hurting guy. So I'm kind of like, okay, maybe I should reach out to him, but no, no, no. And then, unfortunately, I get the call 3 years ago from my brother saying, "Hey, dad passed."
Mm.
My brother grew up with my father. When they split, my brother went to live with my dad. I went to live with my mom. And I was like, "Oh, okay, that's crazy. That's too bad. No, no harm done. Like, I don't really know him. All I know is that he's some monster.
Mm.
So the world's probably better off without him. My protector is just, justifying that I don't need to care about this."
Sure.
And
Take your time.
yeah, so my brother says, like, "Hey, call his caregiver just to check in." And he lived in an institution because he did have mental health challenges. But I know my father, he was very into men's work, funny enough. Like,
Mm.
he went to the original Landmark, and he had Brotherhood. And I know he always went to therapy his whole life because he had to. And when I talked to his caregiver, she just said, like, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was such a good man." And that was really hard to receive. My biases, all the stories that I heard about him were just always such an evil picture. And like that was like, whoa. He was always so well dressed and polite. And like you were sharing before with me, of like, our parents can be the best thing and the worst thing for us. We're all multiple personalities. My father had very loving parts. And he wasn't a great father because he didn't know how to be. And his shame of how he was with his family didn't allow him to just call and say, "Hey, I'm sorry, and I want to be here for you." And she said, "Your father loved you so much. He followed you on Top Chef. He loved you." And I thought he just didn't care and he was evil and bad and all that stuff. So really taking that in was really just like a beautiful moment for me to understand the multiplicity of my father. And that really changed and shifted the way that I started to see the human journey, and kind of this mission of like, I say fight shame, but it's not about fighting shame and making it wrong. It's about integrating it and understanding it so that you can reach out, you can understand it and say, "Hey, I am so much more than my shame. I'm so much more than these stories, these strategies that I have used in the past." And when I can help men, anybody, understand that and see that, you know, that's the destiny that I see in my work moving forward. And with the work that I know my father was in terms of men's groups and therapy, his parts didn't allow him to bring that to the world. It didn't allow him to connect with people in a certain way. And through, very intense IFS sessions, going into some pretty deep realms through psychedelic journeys and through other things, um, I've made a lot of peace with him. And he shows up in my life as a phoenix in the spiritual realm. And he helps me do this work for anybody that's not able to because of their own shame. And he's one of my biggest guides, one of my biggest supports in this work. And I like to think we do it together. And I'm forever grateful for him in all of his pain.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I knew hearing the story was going to be so much bigger than reading about it. And I can't imagine what it was like to not have a relationship with him because of other people's relationship with him and how their pain kept you separated. But then to get that phone call, and I feel like that phone call had so many layers to it because number one, he passed away. And then number two, you hear he was such a great man and he loved you so much. I don't know that I would have been okay yet, even after 3 years, knowing that and knowing what opportunities were missed, um, a deep connection, the the chance for him to tell you his stories, um, to let go of his pain, and maybe just a hug between two adults at this point. That probably would have done so much for your little boy, for your inner child. And I hope that now the work that you're doing and the opportunity that you have to use your story and who you know your father to be now, aside from who he was villainized as because of his deficiencies, gives you that peace. And watching you get emotional, that tells me how deep it is and how meaningful this is to you and how much you care about your father. And I'm sorry that you missed all those years that you could have had. And I pray that what you're doing will give you as much as you can get
Hmm.
out of the relationship with your father that you missed.
Thanks. And like as you say that, I just really realize, and this really sinks deep, and I hope this isn't in too much for some of the listeners, but the peace that I have made with my father in the spiritual realm is fulfilling enough that I don't miss it in the real world. I have this deep soul inner knowing that he supports me, that he's with me, and I know that he is the person that he's always wanted to be right now.
I think that he was supporting you always anyway,
Mm,
um,
absolutely.
the best way he knew how. And if it wasn't for his burden, he may have been able to connect with you and share with you his journey, his story, um, and give you an opportunity to have that support while he was still here. The fact that you feel like you're getting it now makes me happy because as I was sitting with your story, I just thought about what was lost, what was lost, what was lost. How do you get over that? How do you get to a point of forgiveness now? But hearing you explain where you are and the peace that you have, I feel like you have made peace with it to the point to where you're able to not allow what was missed to prevent you from getting anything now. And that is huge.
Couldn't be more true, man. Couldn't be more true. And yeah, if you get into, you know, there's something that shifted in my belief about forgiveness through this journey. And, I do see our realities as two separate things, like a spiritual reality and the reality of this universe. And we need our parts in this in our interactions. We need our parts in this form of reality. And when we move on to the afterlife or whatever that is, the parts that kept us here, the parts that kept us safe using the tools they had and how they knew how and doing the best they could, are no longer needed.
Mm.
And when we step into that spiritual realm, our parts can soften, fall away, so that we can reach a sense of self, of our true inner being. And going into some healing aspects of IFS around my father, going through it, using my father as a trailhead and going into my underworld, so to speak, um, allowed me to connect with him and allowed him to show up for me.
That's huge. That is huge. Um, I wanted to ask you something because you speak about familial shame and specifically in your lineage. And I wanted to ask if you could explain what generational shame is, where it can stem from, and what it can look like.
Mm. Yeah, thanks so much. Within IFS work, there's a branch of legacy cultural burdens. I'll speak to my own experience that maybe some people can relate to. I won't go too like meta in IFS, but like
Sure.
um, in my family, nobody could accept emotions. My emotions were never welcome. I remember when I was a little kid, I told my mom, I was like, "Mom, I'm having a panic attack. I'm having a nervous breakdown because my life was chaos at 10 years old. Like, never had parents around, on my own, didn't have support, trying to figure everything out on my own. And my mom just like lit me up like a Christmas tree
Mm.
of like, you can't have emotions. You're 10 years old. You think you have it hard? What's wrong with you? Like a lot of just like shaming, your emotions are not welcome here. It's like, imagine, do you have any, you said you have an 18-year-old son, right?
Right.
Imagine your 18-year-old son is like a 10-year-old boy and he's saying, Dad, I'm really anxious. And you're saying, and you're just over him, just berating him. Like, that's not going to open him up to, being more like, hey, I'm okay. That's like, I'm scary. I'm wrong. I'm bad. I'm no good. And I can only imagine my mom had the same experience with her parents, right? I'm having a hard time emotionally. Pff, piss off.
Right.
You're not allowed to experience that. Emotions are for adults. And I can only imagine that came from their grandparents and maybe the communities that they were surrounded with growing up, whether that was religious institutions or, uh, you know, um, country clubs or whatever. So it's kind of like generational lineage of shaming. So you're not allowed to have this. You're not allowed to have this. Trevor's not allowed to have it. And if I didn't do my healing work and feel through that, my kids wouldn't be allowed to have it. What we can't accept in ourselves, we can't accept in others. So,
Mm.
when you start to understand that, and when you're starting to think about, do I have this? Do I have, legacy shame or lineage, like shame in my lineage? It's just thinking about like, oh, this, my mom does this too. Or is this older than me? When you actually start to think of it, it's like, is this really mine? Where did I learn this from? Where did I learn that I can't be anxious? Well, my mom told me I can't be anxious. Weird.
Mm.
So starting to look at like where these beliefs came from, maybe feelings of worthlessness or, uh, what's wrong with me? Where did that message come from?
Mm.
Came from my parents. a core belief that something is wrong with me because they were never around, because they were always working. They never connected with me on an emotional level. They never asked me what I needed. Um, and there was a lot of shame in my family. You could tell by the amount of addictions in my family: alcohol, drug use, manipulation, lying. These things, control, perfectionism. Whenever you recognize like an agenda, I need to get something done because if this doesn't get done, something terrible is going to happen. Um, there's probably pointing towards a sense of shame, and then where did that shame come from? How long has it been there for? And then you can kind of go and realize this isn't my shame, and you can hand it back to your lineage and hand it back to a healing place.
Mm.
And when your ancestors are no longer here with their parts to keep that shame bound, and they're all in their highest form, like my father, they just want to help. They just want to help you unburden that and say, thank you for feeling this. Thank you for being the one to feel this, to work through it, so that we no longer have to carry this through our lineage. Because once we do that, you're not going to pass that to your kids.
Mm. Right. Cycle breaking. Thank you for sharing that. I want to circle back to what you do in your profession and how you help men. And I wanted to ask a question based on your experience. How difficult can it be for men to be vulnerable, especially if they're bound and isolated by shame?
Mm, love that inquiry. Yeah, I run anger groups, a 6-week anger program with a practice here in Vancouver, and when these men come in, they're usually there for a court order, because somebody told them they had to be there, or maybe somebody gave them an ultimatum. And so when they come in, the first session is always like stone faces, kind of like, I don't want to be here. Why am I here? What's going to cool? Just sit here and listen to this thing. Like, you don't know what to expect, right? Go to this anger group. Oh, I have to go to an anger thing. That must mean something's wrong with me.
Mm.
I mean, that's the message they get. And so, you know, beginning to go into that and not knowing what to expect, it's like, I'm going to be judged further. I'm going to be criticized even more. I'm going to be told how bad and wrong I am, because that's what got them into this group.
Right.
But when you start to, you know, create a space for them, a safe space with no judgment, no criticism, normalizing emotions, seeing that like what man number 1 struggles with is the same as man number 8,
Mm.
and you start to see yourself in each other's story, that's kind of the opening of like, oh damn, I'm having a hard time too. I'm not alone. I'm not isolated. You feel that? You feel like too?
Mm.
God, me too. And that connection of resonance. And if like going back to my father, if I could just been like, Dad, God, if I just saw your humanness, like, I love you, man. Like, I get it. It's hard. Life is hard.
Yeah.
And more like changes and shifting cannot take place when moral judgment and criticism is present. And I got that from
Mm.
one of my mentors in IFS, Mike Elkin. And that is like a mantra that I have carried with me since I've heard him say that. Because if you start to tell somebody how wrong and bad they are, that doesn't open your heart. That doesn't say, tell me more. Like, I want to listen to you and how I could change. That's like, cart, close, stop, go away. Right. So you need to create that community, or that environment of acceptance, understanding, compassion. And that is not enabling and saying, it's fine, you did what you did. But it's like, let's understand why you did what you did,
Yeah.
so that we can shift that.
Right.
Because with the belief within IFS is that there's no bad parts. They all have a good intention. And when we can find that gold in that cave of why they did what they did, a ton of compassion comes online, and that part will not feel inclined to do that again.
Mm. Thanks for sharing that. And you mentioned IFS a lot, and if there are any listeners that are unfamiliar with internal family systems, that type of therapy or modality of therapy, I wanted to ask you if you could describe IFS, um, kind of break it down on like layman's terms, and then what impact it's had on you personally and professionally.
Awesome, man. Yeah. So my elevator pitch for it, just for time's sake, is that there's two beliefs within IFS. One, we're all made up of multiple personalities. Two is that all of these personalities or parts of us have a positive intention. A really easy way that your listeners can relate to this is a friend asks you for coffee, and there's a part of you that was like, yes, I would love to go for coffee. And another part of you is like, no, absolutely not. I'd rather do anything else. Um, Neither of these parts are wrong, neither of them are bad. They just have their own agendas. They each want to get, one wants connection with someone, one might is really tired and had a big week and wants some relaxation. And now this is all fine and good, and many times when we start to feel a lot of anxiety or there's a big decision, should I stay at my job, should I not, should I be in my relationship, should I not, it can create a lot of inner conflict because these agendas get more important and bigger. And so the other thing of what an IFS session is it's kind of like it can look like a lot like a guided meditation. And it's your job to just kind of speak for what's happening for you. And it's an IFS practitioner's job to just help guide you through that process so that you can develop a relationship with your parts. And that analogy that I used is like our consciousness, our thought process is like a living room, and we're getting to know the players or the characters in your living room.
Mm.
You know, when people somebody says, I'm so angry, I'm so mad, it's like that's not who you are. You're just that's a part of you that's mad. Let's go into your living room and meet them. What are you so mad about, man? What's going on? I get it. I get mad too. I have mad parts all the time. Right? And then you start to befriend these parts of you and not make them wrong or bad, or I can't be angry because if I'm angry, my spouse is going to hate me, or people are going to disconnect from me. But it's we start to develop that relationship with that. And so tying that back into my work, can I go there yet, or do you want to?
Sure, sure.
So it's like, parts have a lot of inner conflict with shame. And there's a lot of parts that hold on to shame. And then if there's a part that has shame, there's probably other parts that shame the part that has a shame. So there's parts that hold shame and there's a shaming part.
Mm.
And so that's kind of the birth of inner conflict, right? Where there's parts like I'm no good, I'm not good, and then there's a critic that's like, that's right, you're a terrible human, you're whatever, da.
Um, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, inner conflict is a topic that you have used a lot. I believe it's on your website as well. So I wanted to ask you, what is an inner conflict and how can unprocessed emotions be involved with that?
Hmm. Yeah, so the way that I see inner conflict is kind of just what I was talking about, right? You have a shamed part and a shaming part. And so there's kind of what we call a polarity, or a yes and a no. Should I stay in this relationship? Should I leave? That's the inner conflict. What do I do? What feels right? Um, and so when we can go into that living room of your mind and really get clear and sit with one of your parts, really get to know it as a friend and intimately, you know, the other side will probably soften. And the way that I can make this relatable to your listeners is like, have you ever had judgments or criticisms about someone else? And you're like, God, I hate that guy.
Mm.
Like, he's so annoying. But then you actually sit down with them and have a conversation with them. And then you actually get to know them. And you're like, oh, he's actually kind of cool. Like, not that bad. Right? We have all these stories and judgments, just like in our inner world, we have all these stories and judgments about these parts that are in an inner conflict. But when we actually get to find like their their trueness, their realness, their positive intention, you're like, huh, I guess I got you wrong. I'm
Mm.
sorry.
Wow, I love
And
that.
when we start to make sense of that, we start to reintegrate our system, because inner conflicts keeps our system fragmented. It keeps it separate. And the goal or the idea is let's welcome all the parts of the campfire. All of you are right. All of you are doing the best you can. And if this isn't how you want to be, let's bring the adult into the room, the mature, wise mind, and move forward in a way that feels good for everybody to have the relationships you desire, because everybody has access to this.
Mm.
And so the more that these parts can soften, the more access we can get to the way we want to move through the world.
Oh, thank you for that detailed explanation. Um, I kind of want to try and tie all this together because the work that you do, the reason why you do it, your story, so uh, um, heart opening, I guess you could say. With everything that you do, and as hard as you work to try to be a model for others, what is it that you want people to know most?
Hmm. Your shame is not who you are. The stories you tell yourself of why I can't reach out to my son or I can't reach out to this person, that's just a part of you holding on to a belief. And if you can actually get support, reach out for a little bit of help for to help just make sense of what's going on there, there is the possibility to find strength and courage to take accountability and move forward to create connection. And I say that because I would have rather had a father that said, I'm sorry and I love you, than not had a father at all.
That is deep. And I think almost anybody in a similar situation would agree with that. And we may at first be guarded because we don't want to feel those feelings, but underneath is always that little boy or that little girl yearning for that closeness and that relationship. So thank you for saying that. Thank you for sharing your story. Um, if someone was to listen to this episode, right, and reach out to me and say, oh my goodness, his story touched me so deeply, and it now made me want to allow space for forgiveness and reconciliation where there wasn't before, what would that mean to you?
That's it, man. If this touches one person to just go, huh, maybe I should do something to create the relationships that I desire, or maybe there's a little person out there that's desiring a relationship with you and it can help your part soften into that possibility. I mean, that's that's life, man. That's soul work. That's the thing that lights up something deeper than just the things that we know on this materialistic plane. So I think that's a collective kind of healing that I strive to contribute to.
Gotcha. I think you're doing an amazing job of that. Um, and I'm really grateful to be able to have had this opportunity to share space with you and allow you to share your story. Um, and I wanted to ask you one last question, and that is, if you could use your platform to educate anyone who might be struggling with their mental or emotional health or shame, and is uncertain of how or where to start, what would you say?
Oh, such a good question. And start with community, whatever you're struggling with, because there are groups, there's support groups for anything. And if it's like, I struggle with drinking because I think I drink too much, reach out to AA just to start. Like, it might not be for you, but it's a community where they're going to unshame your behavior.
Mm.
If you're dealing with grief because you've lost someone, like Google grief groups or like loss groups or like whatever that is within your community, because they're going to unshame your responses to whatever that is. If you're struggling with eating disorders, like whatever it is that like you're like, there is a group for everything out there, especially in today's world with technology that connects everything. a simple Google search where you can reconnect with the world, because a lot of our addictions and a lot of our things keep us separate, isolated, alone. And the first thing we need to do is reconnect with accepting, understanding people that get it, which allows us to reconnect with ourselves. And that will begin the healing journey. So finding like-minded individuals, a community that is going to unshame whatever you're going through, and you can start to get really curious about yourself. That'd be my biggest piece of advice.
Gotcha. When you speak about reconnecting with yourselves and how a disconnect can be created, I remember hearing an analogy of our system being like a chain of islands that has a amazing up and running system of boats that go back and forth between each island. And every time there's a trauma, one boat goes out of service until the point where there is no way to communicate between the islands at all. And that is what a system that is fragmented and disconnected can look like. And when you were explaining that, I thought about that. And then I thought, okay, well, reaching out to a group that may be able to help you with what you're struggling with, that may be a boat that can come out and help you. And the more community you get, you can get your system reconnected until the point where that help can leave and now everything is up and running again. But you can't do it without reaching out for help to begin
Love that analogy. I'll probably use that at some
with.
point. Really good.
All right, Trevor. Well, again, man, this has been great. I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity. I'm grateful for you sharing space with me, reaching out to me, and sharing your story and sharing what it is you do. Um, if someone wanted to find you online or on social media, where would they be able to find you?
Yeah, Instagram, the Trevor Bird, and www.trevorbird.com. Could reach. I'm pretty easily accessible, so that'd be it.
All right, gotcha. All right, brother. Well, again, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing. Thank you for who you are, for what you do, and for the way you do it.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that. Such a pleasure to be here.